He is arguably one of the most despised figures of our time, and like all charismatic leaders, he is also one of the most revered. Above all, the Ayatollah Khomeini is a paradox who used 1,300 years of tradition to pull off the most modern of revolutions. The Ayatollah Khomeini emerged on the international stage in 1979 and instantly came to symbolize one of our nation's most haunting defeats.
Iranian students holding some 60 American embassy employees hostage at the embassy compound in Tehran today warned that they would kill their captives if the United States tried to intervene with force.
Under the Ayatollah, thousands of Iranians were executed. Personal freedoms vanished. In the case of author Salman Rushdie, the wrong words brought a death sentence.
There's this view we have of him. It's this easy view that Khomeini tried to drag Iran into the 7th century. We are dealing with a highly political man. That he wore a turban was accidental.
Khomeini was a towering presence who took on the Shah of Iran, President Carter, and Saddam Hussein. Yet he has remained an enigma who revealed nothing of himself, and over time, fables naturally took root. The result is a story filled with lingering doubts about his date of birth, about how he was raised. Even the most dramatic event of his early life, the murder of his father, remains unsolved. Indeed, the details of the first 60 years of Khomeini's life are shrouded in myth. The facts, like the women of his revolution, veiled in mystery. It is perhaps a fitting legacy for a mystical cleric who became a philosopher king. At the dawn of a new century, Ruhollah al-Musavi was born into a family of ancient traditions. They lived on the fringe of the Iranian desert, in a mud brick house in a dusty hamlet called Khomein. Beyond his place of birth, few facts are known. It has been reported that Khomeini's family was very poor, but family members have said that is not the case.
Contrary to this popular image that the family was terribly poor, he did grow up, according to his brother and other family members, in a lovely house with a lush garden and servants.
They were people who were well off. They were landed people, so he did not come from the underclass of his society. But very few leaders who organize the underclass come from the underclass.
But in turn-of-the-century Iran, a religious pedigree could be as important as money, and it was for this reason that Khomeini's family was relatively prominent. The family traced its lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad, and both Khomeini's grandfather and father were religious scholars, known as mullahs. One seminal event is also certain. When Khomeini was just 6 months old, his father, Sayyid Mustafa, was murdered. According to one popular account, Khomeini's father was killed by the Shah of Iran. But like so much of Khomeini's story, it is simply not true. The Shah would not come to power for 25 more years. Instead, most now agree that Sayyid Mustafa was the victim of a local dispute. The young Khomeini seemed destined for a solitary life. When he was just 6 years old, both his mother and his aunt died of cholera. Suddenly, Khomeini was an orphan. The youngest of 6 children, he was raised by relatives in a devout Islamic environment. He was a precocious child who is said to have read the Quran by the time he was 7. Perhaps because he had no parents of his own, Khomeini gravitated toward his religious teachers. As a teenager, he followed a leading theologian to the holy city of Qom. Here, he would prepare to become a teacher himself.
A student like that would be assigned a small room in one of the courtyards of this great complex of schools and seminaries. And this is a training that is still very medieval in its structure, in that it is basically a study of texts. I think, the formation was crucial with Khomeini.
But Khomeini was expected to do more than study. At the age of 27, he approached an affluent Ayatollah and asked for his daughter's hand in marriage. The 15-year-old girl, Khadijeh, served the suitor tea. But in keeping with custom, she was completely covered by a veil, or chador.
And she liked what she'd seen. And so that night she had a dream, and she dreamt that all the prophets were gathered together, and all of them were talking about what a great religious leader that young Ruhollah from Khomeini was going to turn out to be. And she told her parents, and that they thought the dream was divinely inspired, and so they allowed the match to go ahead.
Khadijeh, it seems, chose well. By most accounts, Khomeini was an ideal husband.
According to his family, Ayatollah Khomeini was really quite the New Age man. He would get up in the night when his children were babies and take a turn to give them their bottles. He never asked his wife to do anything for him, not even so much as to bring him a glass of water or to match his socks.
But if Khomeini's life was peaceful, the political climate was not. In 1925, an uneducated soldier named Reza Shah came to power. The new leader was committed to creating a Western secular state, in part by undermining the religious elite.
And Reza Shah was determined to destroy the clergy. At one point, we know he stormed into one of the seminaries in Qom and personally whipped one of the mullahs. And Khomeini, as a man, felt this, the force of this grievance, and felt the heavy hand of Reza Shah.
Khomeini took the Shah's actions very personally, for religion was both his tradition and his profession. The Shah was, in effect, attacking all that Khomeini was. And when the Shah ruled that women were forbidden to wear the chador in public, he made an enemy of Khomeini's wife, Khadijeh, too.
She didn't leave her house for more than a year when the prohibition on the chador was being most stringently enforced. And Khadijeh stayed at home even though their home had no bathroom, which was fairly typical of simple homes in Iran at that time. And she needed to go to the public bathhouse. Well, she had to go without that.
In the 1930s, Khomeini, like his mentor, began teaching at the seminary in Qom. He was known for bringing politics into the classroom and advised his students to be moral in the face of oppression.
He always said the most important holy war that a Muslim can carry out is not the external war, but the internal war, the mastery of self. And I think young seminarians found all that very exciting.
Khomeini may have been popular with his students, but he could be strict with his family. In the 1930s, Khomeini had 8 children. His daughter Zahra has said that Khomeini imposed the same austerity on his sons that he demanded of himself.
He had 2 sons, and Zahra says that she remembers one of the few fights between her mother and father was over the mother's having bought a ball for Ahmed to play with, and he didn't believe that his son should be spending time frivolously by playing ball.
But in these volatile times, even Khomeini became preoccupied with less spiritual matters. When, during World War II, the Allies ousted the Shah of Iran and installed his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, on the throne, Khomeini wrote a book of protest.
We have in this book the early hint as to the kind of government Khomeini regards as ideal. In this book, he doesn't oppose the institution of monarchy, but he does say that the monarch should be chosen by the clerical community, and he should be a king who will rule according to Islamic law.
Khomeini's anti-Western views were shared by many Iranians. In 1953, a nationalist movement became so popular that the Shah fled Iran. Within a matter of days, however, an American-sponsored coup returned him to power. For Khomeini, the coup was yet another demonstration of Western arrogance. But Khomeini refrained from public commentary out of respect for his religious superior and mentor.
He had a period of relative quiescence because the main religious leaders who were senior to him were not political people. They wanted to stay out of the line of fire, and he heeded their advice and he heeded their counsel.
But in 1961, Khomeini's mentor died, and suddenly Khomeini was free to speak out. After a lifetime of obscurity, the cleric from Qom was ready for revolution. A legendary leader was about to be born. By 1963, Khomeini was a senior cleric in the religious center of Qom. He had risen to the level of Ayatollah, meaning literally, reflection of God. Revered for his uncompromising dedication to Islam, the Ayatollah, who had fathered 3 sons and 5 daughters, had grown more lenient in private. According to one daughter, the Ayatollah was a doting grandfather.
She talks about him very warmly. She talks about his relations with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, how much, even though he presented himself so austerely, there was room for fun with the kids, that when they played hide and seek, he would let them hide under his long clerical robes.
But these moments of levity were rare. The Ayatollah was deadly serious when it came to the fate of his country. He was particularly angered by the Shah's attempt to modernize Iran, a 1963 reform movement known as the White Revolution.
It was an attempt on the part of the Shah to speak the language of reform, and this gave Khomeini all the ammunition he needed.
Khomeini seized his moment and delivered an emotionally charged sermon during the Islamic month of mourning. Khomeini likened the Shah to the fabled assassin of a 7th century martyr.
He was completely fearless, and I think that a lot of people were drawn to him because of this quality he had.
I think the speech not only was an extraordinarily harsh political attack on the king, but it also was a very major assertion of clerical authority against that of the state.
The next day, the Shah had Khomeini thrown in prison. Several days of rioting followed as years of pent-up rage spilled onto the streets. The Ayatollah, it seemed, had arrived on the national stage.
The extent of the rioting that took place would suggest that already by 1963 he had a large following, not only in the city of Qom, where he had been a very popular teacher among seminarians and the public at large, but also in other cities as well. And it also tells us something about Khomeini's extraordinary ability to seize the moment, to know what themes, what rhetoric resounded powerfully with his listeners.
After 10 months in prison, Khomeini was released, but hardly subdued. In October of 1964, Khomeini had a new crusade against a law that extended immunity to American military personnel. For Khomeini, it was proof that the West was more entrenched than ever.
Khomeini went to the crowd and told them, look, there is now a system of capitulations in Iran, that the Americans now can rule your country, that an American dog, I think it was his language, now had more rights than an Iranian.
Khomeini's protest reverberated in the schools, in the bazaars, in the mosques. Within days, the Ayatollah was exiled, first to Turkey, and later to the major Shiite center of Najaf, Iraq. Here he lived in a 2-story cement house with Hadijeh, where his daily routine remained unchanged.
he kept very bizarre hours because he would wake up in the middle of the night to pray from about 3 in the morning till about 6 in the morning. So it was a routine and one that was, by our standards, a bit strange.
Like the monastic days of his youth, in Najaf, Khomeini led a simple, serious, and highly ordered life.
He was also almost obsessively clean in his own personal habits. He would wear a sort of a bib to take his meals so he wouldn't get any specks of food on his clothing. When he was taking medications, he would use a separate spoon for each medicine bottle to get out the pills that he needed to take. He was quite germ-phobic, it sounds like, almost to a pathological extent.
But throughout his exile, the Ayatollah never lost sight of his one simple message, that the Shah had to go. In many instances, it was his students in Najaf who relayed these pronouncements back to students in Iran. At other times, Khomeini's own family was enlisted.
His daughter would go and visit him in his exile in Iraq and bring back his speeches. She would hide them in her clothes, and then they would secretly reproduce them. And then they'd go around by night, and she would have her young son climb up the high walls and throw these incendiary pamphlets over the walls of the houses, and that was one way that he got his message out.
Yet as much as Khomeini was a recognized religious leader, he was not presenting himself as a politician. For most anti-monarchists, the Ayatollah was a valuable rabble-rouser, not a future statesman.
I didn't consider him a political analyst or someone who was interested in political theory. It was really my mistake. I should have. His book, Islamic Government, definitely was a significant political pamphlet that should have been read by people like me, but we didn't pay attention to it.
Yet, as if on cue, the Shah began providing the Ayatollah with unlimited opportunities to galvanize support. In 1973, the Shah pushed OPEC to raise the price of oil. Money began pouring into the country, yet with the influx of riches came greater repression.
There is a passage in Shakespeare which says, so foul a sky clears not without a storm. The Shah had created a foul sky in Iran.
For Khomeini, the attacks began to hit very close to home. In January of 1978, a scathing criticism of Khomeini appeared in a government-controlled newspaper. Many followers believed the article had been planted by the Shah and exploded with a series of demonstrations. By the end of the year, hundreds of protesters had been killed. Khomeini publicly blamed the Shah for the deaths. Many believe that the Shah, furious and perhaps afraid, asked Iraq to throw the Ayatollah out. Iraq complied. And Khomeini turned to France, where he settled into the Paris suburb of Neuf-le-Château.
Apparently, when he was driving from the airport to the house, he didn't look out the car window once because he didn't want to be corrupted by any visions of the hated West.
Once he settled in, there were other adjustments to be made. The cleric, who had become so used to the monastic life, found himself in a very modern world.
The suburban house that had been obtained for him had a Western-style pedestal toilet. Well, he thought that this was an example of Western decadence, and he wanted to stick to the traditional ways of Persian culture, which is a squat facility, so he had the pedestal toilet removed and a squat toilet installed.
But even in the suburbs of Paris, Khomeini recreated his ancient routines.
Twice a day, he would come out of his house and walk over to an apple tree, sit down with a little pillow propped behind his back, dressed in a sort of brown cloak and his turban and these funny blue plastic sandals, and preach to about 30 or 40 students who came from around Europe to pay homage.
Allahu
was a very quiet, serene atmosphere in those days. And I looked at it just as an interesting sort of feature story on a funny old religious man who thought he could bring Islamic revolution to Iran.
Allahu Akbar.
There were people who came back spreading the good news that this was a humble man, a simple man, who just simply wants the good of his nation. And when the time comes, he will bow out and he will leave politics to those who know politics.
But as the world press descended on the tiny enclave, a very different Ayatollah would begin to emerge. In the months ahead, Khomeini would overthrow the Shah, create a religious dictatorship, and hold America hostage. By 1978, the Ayatollah Khomeini had been catapulted to international prominence. He was an unlikely celebrity, a grandfather in his late 70s, whose life experience was centered on the 7th century Quran. Yet he was leading a very modern revolution that was about to change the world.
It was a masterful media operation, which was very strange. It was the first cassette revolution. He had a whole staff of young students who turned the garage of one of the houses into a sort of cassette reproduction center. So he would give a sermon, they would tape it, and they would mass produce it and ship it back to Iran. It really was a media revolution, and we were complicit.
But while attention was focused on Khomeini, his nemesis, the Shah, was rapidly losing ground. The Iranians' rage had hit critical mass. The country collapsed in riots and strikes. Finally, on January 16, 1979, the Shah gave up his fight.
And it's the most exhilarating, the most joyous day of my life. I had never seen Tehran to be in such a mood of celebration.
For Khomeini, it was an unprecedented victory. After 14 years in exile, the Ayatollah came home. Millions of Iranians, rich and poor, religious and secular, flooded the streets in support. Yet even with this awesome outpouring, the Ayatollah appeared strikingly unmoved.
One journalist asked him, "What are you feeling?" And he looked up and he said, "Nothing." In the true tradition of Shiite Islam, he covered over his true feelings and just acted as if this was business as usual.
It was, of course, not business as usual. Khomeini's return was cast in a messianic light. He was seen as a spiritual guide, one who presumably would not be involved in the earthly matters of government.
At the time, I saw Khomeini as the Mahatma Gandhi of Iran, someone who wants to introduce an element of nativity, tradition into the political order, someone who is not interested in power, someone who does not see himself as the next head of state.
But slowly, mortal cracks of ambition began to appear in Khomeini's seemingly divine facade. No longer a symbolic leader, Khomeini was in fact running the government through a radical revolutionary council of Ayatollahs. With networks that reached into the nation's seminaries and mosques, the Revolutionary Council directed local mullahs to become footmen in an undeclared cultural war. Suddenly, there were reports that residents were being arrested for drinking. or listening to music in their own homes. On the streets, women were forced into chadors. Revolutionary tribunals were established, and within months, as many as 600 perceived traitors were executed.
There was, of course, at the very beginning, a bloodletting, a killing of many people. For people in the educated, more secular stratum of society, those people who did not flee at the time of the revolution, every one of them can tell you some ghastly story.
But amid the chaos, there was one terrorist act of which Khomeini did not approve. In February, a leftist group seized the U.S. embassy. An angered Khomeini quickly intervened.
He asks his own representative to go to the embassy and ask the students to immediately vacate the compound. It means that at the first, Khomeini considered hostage-taking as an illegitimate and unacceptable political tool.
But 8 months later, everything changed. When the Shah, now ill with cancer, was allowed into the United States for treatment, the revolution became overtly anti-American. In November of 1979, the U.S. Embassy was seized for a second time that year. This time, Iranian students held American staff members hostage in exchange for the forced return of the Shah.
There was sort of this carnival atmosphere. There were people hawking peanuts and beetroot and souvenirs, and whenever the TV cameras would turn on, the crowds would go crazy and scream, "Death to America." And then the TV cameras would turn off and everybody would sort of go about their business again. This was extraordinary theater.
When Khomeini saw the popular response, he gave his blessing. At a time when the Ayatollah was trying to win national support for an Islamic constitution, he saw the anti-American fervor as a ticket toward a theocracy. The spiritual guide, it seemed, was evolving into a cynical politician.
The hostage crisis was the weapon with which Khomeini bludgeoned the liberals in his own entourage. He destroyed them. And it was the weapon with which he radicalized the Iranian revolution. And let's face it, let's give the devil his due. It worked.
In December of 1979, it came as little surprise that Iranians voted for the first 20th century theocracy. For Khomeini, it was the ultimate triumph, the reward for standing up to Western arrogance. But with the success of the revolution came a price. Just as Khomeini had demonized America and President Carter, Americans had come to see Khomeini as the outlaw leader of a terrorist state.
I'd like to thank all the American people who have stood by us during this trying ordeal.
As the hostage countdown dragged on, Khomeini found himself in an international crisis way beyond his experience.
Let's just hope it's over soon. That's all.
But then the Ayatollah was saved by a terrible tragedy. In April of 1980, 6 months after the hostage crisis began, President Carter authorized a covert and ultimately ill-fated rescue mission. 2 aircraft went down in the desert, and 8 American rescuers were killed. Khomeini said it was God's way of protecting Islam. And indeed, the failed mission was, for Khomeini, like a gift from God. For now, his revolution was complete. But in a matter of months, Khomeini would face his greatest fight of all. By 1980, the Ayatollah Khomeini had done the impossible. He had ousted his enemy, humbled the United States and created the 20th century's first theocracy. Finally, fate delivered one more grim reward. In July, the Shah of Iran died in exile. And yet, Khomeini's greatest challenge was still to come. In September, Iran was invaded by neighboring Iraq. Technically, it was a grab for land lost in a 1975 agreement. But like so many of the Ayatollah's battles, it was also very personal.
It was a war between two leaders. Saddam Hussein had a personal vendetta against Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini had called him an infidel. He had challenged his legitimacy. So it was not just a war for land and a war for influence, but it was a war of enmity.
It was also a time when Iran was vulnerable to attack. Since the hostage crisis had begun almost a year ago, Iran had been economically isolated. And with many of the Shah's military experts now purged, the odds were clearly in Iraq's favor. Again, the Ayatollah used this to his political advantage.
Ironically, it helped strengthen the revolutionary government. Once Iran was at war with an external enemy, it became possible to mobilize the country again and to unify it behind this very major endeavor. It also became easier to silence internal dissent with the excuse that the country was fighting an external war.
Drawing once again on the passionate rhetoric he had used against the Shah, Khomeini mobilized an army of young martyrs.
Some of the so-called warriors had very, very old weapons. Some of them only carried sticks. They sometimes wore headbands that said "Warriors of God."
But for a war fought in the name of religion, Khomeini's principles were surprisingly flexible. According to the former UN ambassador from Iran, when Khomeini learned that vital equipment being sold by European arms dealers had originated in Israel, Khomeini approved the purchase.
Khomeini replied, "We are not religiously obligated to ask them where they get the merchandise. Go and purchase the spare parts." Which was the beginning of a sustained trading in military weapons and spare parts with Israel during the entire war period. And the Israelis were selling arms to Iran because they didn't want Iran to be militarily defeated by a regime they considered to be far more dangerous.
The time had come to reevaluate the hostage crisis as well. President Carter had frozen billions of dollars worth of Iranian assets. Now that money was desperately needed. There were also other issues to consider. The Ayatollah already felt that he had defeated Jimmy Carter, but Ronald Reagan could prove to be a tougher opponent. Negotiations began in the fall, and in January of 1981, after 444 days in captivity, the American hostages were released.
The planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
But with the hostage crisis no longer the rallying cry, Khomeini continued to fight internal battles. In August, the president and prime minister were both assassinated. Amnesty International reported that over 1,600 executions had occurred since Khomeini's reign began. But the Ayatollah's reach went way beyond the political. Culturally, the Islamic regime had grown unimaginably rigid. Personal freedoms for women, in particular, seemed to vanish overnight. Suddenly, women were being jailed for showing hair in public. They required their husband's permission to leave the country. And women convicted of adultery continued, in the ancient tradition, to be stoned to death. Yet Khomeini's fundamentalism was also surprisingly liberating for the poor women of Iran. Once they were covered and segregated, the Ayatollah valued their participation in the revolution.
Suddenly here was a cleric who was telling them that they had not only a right but a responsibility to be out in public life. And when it comes to women, we think of him as a hardliner on women's issues, but in fact in the Iranian spectrum he was a moderate.
When it came to Saddam Hussein, however, the Ayatollah was anything but moderate. In 1982, Khomeini declined a ceasefire with Iraq. Despite the odds and the terrible toll the war had already taken, Khomeini was determined to succeed.
At that time, Khomeini, which was the peak of his megalomania, he thought that he could do the same thing to Saddam as he did to the Shah and President Carter in his mind. So he wanted to export the revolution. He saw the defeat of Saddam Hussein as an important step.
Khomeini did not accept a ceasefire until 1988, but by then Iran had been ravaged by 8 years of war and almost 10 years of internal chaos. Yet despite the constant disappointments, Khomeini managed to rally his followers and shock the world one last time. By 1989, Khomeini had proven to be both a fearless revolutionary and a resilient politician. Physically, he was weak. He was by now in his late 80s and had been suffering from a heart condition. But as a leader, he remained a vigorous manipulator of symbols and sentiments. In February, Khomeini was informed that a former Muslim author named Salman Rushdie had written a book that was said to have blasphemed the Prophet. Khomeini may have never actually read the book, but in typical fashion, he almost certainly read the volatile temper of the times.
It wasn't his cause. He found it. It was brought to his attention. He sensed it. He knew what he could do with it, and he used it.
Khomeini issued an edict, or fatwa, calling for Rushdie's execution.
The fatwa of Imam Khomeini bent the world out of shape. Ancient bloodlusts were unleashed, armed with state-of-the-art modern technology.
The fatwa on Rushdie was vintage Khomeini. He rode on someone else's cause, and he preempted them because he understood that here was yet another way that you can keep Iran isolated and embattled.
Rushdie was forced underground. Like the Americans before him, he became Khomeini's hostage.
He was obviously a very frightened man, and I don't blame him. At the university, those who are real Islamists, the young, are still as angry as can be at Salman Rushdie.
To the world, the fatwa was a potent symbol of a revolution and a revolutionary gone awry. And that, it has been said, was precisely the point.
When Khomeini chose to deliver his judgment against Rushdie, he had some purpose. And the argument's made that Khomeini did this in order to freeze this warming process toward the West that people in the government were undertaking.
But if this was Khomeini's most political and alienating gesture to date, it was also his last. In June of 1989, the Ayatollah underwent surgery. There were complications due to internal bleeding, and a series of heart attacks followed. In a matter of days, the Ayatollah died. The funeral was, like so much of Khomeini's life, at once passionate and political, symbolic and sincere.
That whole city of Tehran was like a river of black. People dressed in mourning clothes were just pouring down every street and every avenue from far, far into the mountains that ring the city. It was an astonishing sight.
It was astonishing, perhaps, but not surprising. For if Americans had seen Khomeini as a religious fascist who had wrought only destruction, many Iranians saw instead a liberator who had brought them a sense of national dignity.
I remember going to a party with some very westernized miniskirt wearing, Madonna playing Tehranis, and one of them, much to my astonishment, said that she'd cried and had to take a Valium when she heard that he'd died. She still respected the way he'd stood up to the West, and she said nobody in their history had done that before. I think he gave a lot of Iranians a real pride.
It is an ironic legacy, a simple cleric who rose to defeat a dictator, only to become one himself.
Once he was in the position of power, his absolutist and self-righteous ideology expedited and intensified the process of corruption. But he proved that even a 75-year-old man could be deeply corrupted by power.
Khomeini, to a certain extent, was a mirage. He was all things to all people, and yet, in many ways, not any of those things. He was a brilliant politician, a victor of circumstances.
Khomeini's legacy, like his life, is also a paradox. For Khomeini was a cleric with political ambitions, a modern husband who, according to Western standards, codified misogyny, a conservative who challenged the status quo, and finally, an oppressor who came to symbolize freedom.
Khomeini will stand out as one of the at least half-dozen most important figures of the 20th century. The change represented by that revolution and the inspiration it gave to religious political movements around the world, I think, is incalculable.
He was a man who made no apologies for the dictatorship he imposed, because it was a dictatorship for the good. And there is a riddle about Khomeini. Did Khomeini save Iran, or did he destroy it? And the honest answer must surely be both.